Welcome to the Calling the Quarters podcast. I'm your host, Dean Jones. This is Season 3, Episode 1. Today we're thrilled to welcome scholar Jennifer Ball to the Calling the Quarters podcast. Jennifer hails from Wirral in England and is currently wrapping up her PhD at Bangor University in Wales. Her research dives deep into the experiences of LGBTQ+ individuals within paganism. Specifically, she's examining the impact on heteronormative and cisnormative themes that can exist across various pagan paths. Her work has even been featured within the wild hunt community. Jennifer's fascination with paganism began with her undergraduate dissertation, where she explored the evolution of witch iconography throughout history. This discussion delved into the reclamation of the witch identity within Wiccan, witchcraft, and goddess communities, sparking a passion in both academic and personal exploration of paganism. She then embarked upon the research master's degree, where she tackled three captivating topics: commodified witchcraft, investigating the influence of the 90s media witch craze on contemporary Wicca, the revival of nature-based religions, delving into the ancient roots of modern Druidry, and lastly, paganism, the new religion of the 21st century, which examined the rapid growth of paganism in Western society. I'm now going to take you to my conversation with scholar Jennifer Ball. Welcome to the Calling the Quarters podcast. I'm your host, Dean Jones, and today I'm very happy to be talking with pagan researcher Jennifer Ball. Jennifer, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks. It's good to be here.
Now, for our listeners who are not familiar with you, can you tell us where you're from in the world?
So I come from an area called the Wirral, which is just south of Liverpool in England, UK.
Now, for our guests on the show, we like to ask people, because there's a lot of diversity in the big umbrella that we call, for lack of a better term, maybe paganism. So do you identify yourself as a pagan, or how do you identify yourself?
Yeah, so I definitely would consider myself pagan. However, I don't adhere to the typical, not that there is a typical image of a pagan, but it's very personal, very solitary, and I would say very secular in practice. So I definitely focus more upon the nature element as opposed to any sort of deity aspect.
Now, your your research is about heteronormativity within the pagan community and how it relates to the LGBT community. Can we talk a little bit about that, and why you're interested in this topic? And also, I kind of want to ask as well, have you witnessed any instances of inclusion or marginalization based on sexual orientation or gender identity within the community?
Yeah, so I mean, just to reiterate again, because I'm UK based, this is where my research will be focused.
Right.
So everything I talk about is really based on the experiences and findings from the UK, but more specifically Wales, Scotland, and England. And so it could be very, very different elsewhere. But overall, the heteronormative and cisnormative themes are quite prevalent in things like the mythologies, the themes, and the symbolism that are used throughout paganism. And so this can often be attributed to the regeneration, shall we say, which took place in around the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So this is about the time where the likes of homosexual relationships, they were illegal, and a lot of non-conforming gender identities, they were almost unheard of at that time. And also feminism was really rife, and so we have second wave feminists who were trying to alter this perception of feminine roles that were thought of as being weak. And so at the times, things like Wicca, and I use Wicca as an example because it's statistically typically the largest and most familiar practice within paganism.
Right.
But yeah, so Wicca was kind of revolutionary, empowering for a lot of people at that time, not just women, but mainly women who were looking for female representation in the deity. And so quite often, a lot of the time, because of this and because that Wicca is the most represented, or typically the most represented pagan practice, it's often mistook to be a women-only tradition. And so we have the fact that a lot of also these ancient mythologies that have been looked at, and they've been looked at through heteronormative and cisnormative lens over the years, because that was typically the norm. And so there's been some alterations and a lot of aspects that have been disregarded over time about these deities that are featured and that show alternative views of how the, say, protagonists of the stories are represented. So, for example, I was speaking to somebody fairly recently and they were pagan and they were also a historian and they had a lot of reverence for Aphrodite. And Aphrodite can be portrayed to have a beard, but the most popular depiction is that she's this kind of object of the male gaze, or what people think the male gaze is. And she's often slim with long hair, and she adheres to a lot of these stereotypical attributes of beauty. And just because this is a popular view, it doesn't mean that these alternative views aren't out there. They just need to be looked for. So to summarize, I would say like heteronormativity and cisnormativity, they are there within paganism and they are prevalent in a lot of the themes. But when it comes to real life, and this is why I find it so interesting, is that the statistics kind of refute and contradict this. And so because over the years, like when we look at this existing statistics, although there are very few, we see that the LGBTQ plus community within it grows. And so this is especially compared to other religions and general society. So the figures are really high compared to that, even when they're at their lowest within paganism, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
even though a lot of the themes can be heteronormative and cisnormative, and they do exist, it's not kind of reflected in the numbers. So heterosexual people in relationships and cisgendered people, you know, they're not as high in figures as what you would compare to in the likes of other religions and general society. So yeah.
Now, you touched on deity, and I want to kind of talk about that a bit. Pagan
Mhm.
traditions often have a rich history of mythology and deities encompassing various expressions of sexuality and gender. How do you see this reflected or not reflected in contemporary pagan practices?
So this one I find quite difficult to answer because like we said, paganism is so vast.
Right.
And I think that's the key point, and then the key point to this question really would be the flexibility of pagan beliefs. So
Yeah.
one of the growing communities within paganism is the solitary and the eclectic. I mean, I feel like potentially I'm a good example of that as well, is so that
Yeah.
people are getting more inventive because they can, and why shouldn't they?
Right.
So one of the central themes across the different communities and the subgroups, like I said, is kind of this flexibility, this fluidity. So we know that there's no doctrine within paganism, and there's no one saying that your individual interpretation is wrong, because the whole point is that it's experiential. So it's how you experience things, it's how you relate to things. There's no one way. And so there are so many different pantheons that you can choose, and you can choose what resonates with you, if any at all. So, like I said, you know, paganism does have the opportunity to be more secular and not necessarily religious and include all of these deities. And so, anyway, hopefully I didn't divert too much there, but there are plenty of options available. And so the sources to find this information, they're growing too. And you have the likes of figures such as Yvonne Abarrow and Raven Caldera, and they've both promoted queer practices in books. And so, if anybody is wanting to explore any non-cisnormative deity, then Caldera's book, I think it's called Hermaphrodites, and I think that's a good place to start. And so, I know that the Pagan Federation in the UK has also created things like a podcast, and one of the episodes there was LGBTQ plus paganism, and that spoke a lot to multiple people who spoke about their relation between their spirituality and their sexuality and or their gender identity. So the individual sources are there for those who are looking, And so if you just typed in words like queer practice or queer spirituality, queer craft, things will come up and they are available. Within the wider community, there's things like festivals and events, they're all happening. And I know in the UK, there was such thing as queer pagan camp, but they haven't resumed since post-COVID. But a lot of other events are declaring themselves as LGBTQ plus safe spaces. So again, it's a tough one to answer because I can't speak on behalf of individual covens or individual orders, blots, moots, all these different things. And I think it would always be impossible to kind of calculate because of the sort of secretive and apprehensive nature of some of paganism. Um, and so, yeah, these small local groups, they do kind of lost my train of thought a little bit. They do adhere and they do change according to those who are within it.
Yeah.
And even in personal practices as well, with individual worship, and like I said, the kind of solitary practice is becoming more prominent. And you can see this even within like online talks and Facebook groups, things like that. A lot of people are mentioning Loki more and more.
Right.
And I think that typically Loki was this character that was feared in many ways because of the kind of chaos that surrounds them. But you're hearing Loki just coming out more and more, and I think that's a really good indicator that things are generally changing to be less cisnormative and heteronormative because they, as a person, it could be perceived as bisexual and non-gender conforming because they change a lot.
Right.
I mean, look at even Marvel, that this is proven in the depiction of, pop culture, the pop culture Marvel version of Loki in the new series shows him, in all of the different universes as all the different genders and he changes and things like that. So yeah, all of these things are definitely available and they can be seen reflected. But yeah, it's just I think they're a little bit less available than the heteronormative model currently.
Yeah. I mean, it's something I think about quite a bit now because so many of the people that I see in the community are non-binary, and many people do not have the traditional male or female roles anymore. They have different roles, and it's often, there's not a lot of homogeneousness regarding that. And so then we do rituals like the drawing down the moon or the Great Rite, and then you have this kind of thing where you're really enforcing gender stereotypes in many ways. And I kind of always think this is the elephant on the table now because we just, I think older pagans like myself may just assume, we're all on the same page, but we're not really
Mm.
necessarily on the same page anymore in that regard. So
Yeah.
now these rituals involve gendered pairings for people that aren't unaware of that. They often like have depictions of the male and the female as goddess and god. How do these traditions evolve or adapt to be more inclusive to LGBTQ community individuals who may not identify in traditional gender roles?
So I've kind of briefly touched upon that the adaptations are definitely out there and they're definitely available. And groups are doing things like removing gender altogether. And
Yeah.
another one that I do think is overlooked as well is sexualization. So when we think of alternative sexualities, we often jump to the idea of same-sex relationships not being represented. And the idea of asexuality, so the non-sexual, is often overlooked. So even though paganism is very sex positive and that is great in so many respects, the heteronormative symbolism, it can not only bother the likes of gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, non-binary, all of those members of the community, but also the non-sexual community too.
Right.
But with regards specifically to gender roles, I do think it's really important to acknowledge that, kind of like what you said, is it does harm everyone, these stereotypes.
Yeah.
So, for example, for the question's sake, if we narrowed it down to the imagery of the great goddess and the horned god, so the goddess is always seen as this nurturing mother. She's like the womb bearer. She's the giver of life. And that is lovely. Again, in so many ways, it's really, really empowering. But it isn't, you know, it's quite reductive in its nature too. So,
Yeah.
as me as a person, I'm almost 29 and I currently have no children and next to no desire currently. This could change, but I don't have any desire to have them. And I think this is quite a common thought, for people in general, but AFAB people too in the modern world. So my parents had two children by the time they were my age, and that was
Yeah.
normal.
Yeah.
And the generation before it was even younger, and that's the point, I think, is that times change and times are changing, and we're definitely in a big change at the moment. And so women want to be represented as more than just a mother. So now and again, and I can't stress this enough, there is power in all of these things. So there is still a lot of power in the imagery of a woman being very motherly and the power of reproduction, things like that. But the point, I think, and the most important point, is that doesn't have to be the main representation. And again, for men, the horned god is this aggressive hunter-gatherer protector type. But we're in a time where everybody's trying to crack down on toxic masculinity and that it's okay for men to take on more stereotypical effeminate roles. So, like the caregiver, the nurturer, emotionally intelligent, and even stuff like the artsy. And I know Beltane is often most criticized for this. So people have, again, they've been removing this gendered nature of the symbolism by thinking about the fertility of the land in ways other than just one sperm, one egg coming together to create a new life. And so you have these alternative gender identities that don't and can't relate to the representation of this sperm and the egg. And you also have cisgendered people too. So I think the point is that the outcry doesn't just come from the LGBTQ plus community. It comes from a good majority of people as a whole. And I've heard many arguments when it comes to gender representation that also talk about the infertile and those who have had hysterectomies or vasectomies, along with trans women and trans men. So your value shouldn't be reduced down to your reproductive ability, even if it isn't overtly said. Sometimes the imagery and the implications can be just as damaging as saying it overtly. And I'm not saying, again, paganism definitely doesn't openly sort of slander any of these people by saying they're not as important. But I think
Right.
that if the representation of the divine is something that you can't relate to, then it's kind of does lead to a feeling of inadequacy.
Right.
So, just because that is the image, you don't want people to feel like they're not as valued as somebody who can reproduce naturally and adheres to these gender binary roles. So ultimately, like I said, it's not just an outcry from the LGBTQ plus community. It's definitely an outcry from the cisgendered and the heterosexuals who just don't or feel a little bit more uncomfortable seeing it represented so forwardly, if that makes sense.
It does. And such an important, what you just said was so important. And I just am so glad you're articulating this well, because it's something I think that is out there, but people have often not really known how to say it or what to say. And you really summed it up very well.
Oh, thank you.
In the UK, are there specific denominations or traditions that are more welcoming to the LGBTQ plus individuals? If so, what aspects of these traditions contribute to that inclusivity?
Ooh, I think, and I don't want this to seem like I'm putting it off, but I think this one's quite impossible to answer, really. And that's not just UK wide, I think that is globally.
Right,
Because what I can say is that people often assume that the problems are found within Wicca or heathenry,
right.
because Wicca is typically seen as this cis females religion, and heathenry is often tarnished with the idea that it's filled with, I think I've heard the term Viking bros, and obviously with the
Yeah,
extreme right wing ideology. And these are the assumptions. From what I've seen in my research, is that this isn't necessarily true to tradition, it's more individual people that had
Right.
these ideas. So again, I do want to reiterate that the majority for paganism, despite any symbolism or traditional ritual that we've kind of looked at so far, they are mostly accepting of LGBTQ plus individuals. So I think the one thing that needs to be improved by all is more the communication and the purpose of some of these groups and rituals that are being formed. Like I said earlier, there's still a lot of power in some of these cisnormative and heteronormative images. And it's okay to still honor things like a monthly bleed or gender specific life experiences. But I think it needs to be clearly stated beforehand, no matter what kind of subgroup you're from, what, wherever or what pagan path that you adhere to. I think if people want to partake, they need to make an informed decision on whether the purpose of the ritual or the talk or just the group, as long as it applies to them. So it's really hard because again, we spoke about how paganism is all about this freedom of expression, and that is, the beauty of it, and that's what's so interesting about it. And you can't enforce any sort of regime over these things without contradicting this theme of freedom of expression. And so again, I don't want to defame or promote any particular traditions because it's all down to the people. But I think if
Right.
I absolutely had to choose one that seems to be the least problematic, even though I've said that the majority aren't problematic anyway, it's more just people, but I would say that maybe the reclaiming tradition. So that's the
Right.
one who's spearheaded by Starhawk, and they are openly striving for equality for all. So that's the key premise of that entire tradition. So I would say that that one probably just by that would be the most inclusive.
Are you aware of any initiatives or movements within the pagan community specifically working towards dismantling heteronormativity? Can you describe any such efforts?
So yeah, I've kind of like touched on little things throughout. So there are groups countrywide and globally making an effort to dismantle these heteronormative and cisnormative themes. But as I've also said, it's kind of impossible to truly know on what scale, because paganism's not very well researched, and it's known as like a mystery tradition, and there's a lot that
Right.
can be said about that. Is that people, although they want to kind of have paganism accepted by the wider culture, I think they also, as a community, want to reserve a lot. So you know, personal and small communities, they are accommodating to their members from what I can see. And ultimately, it's important to say that people, even those who are members of an LGBTQ plus community, they do sometimes like the heteronormative model. So every opinion is valid. And even though it's important that we show variety and dismantle heteronormativity, there's also no problem with still wanting to have the option of an heteronormative model. And it's understandable why people like it, and it's also just as equally understandable why people don't. So I think the efforts of people wanting to move away from it are important because it provides a variety for people and representation for those who are typically marginalized and wanting to feel like they're represented. But you want to make them feel as equally as important by, without eradicating the other. So because everybody is just as equal and as valid as each other, no one is better than the other. So although a lot of people are making an effort by showing more representation in ritual or removing gendered symbolism altogether, I do think it's important to mention that gendered stuff is so relevant and meaningful and powerful for those that still want it. But the important thing is that the prevalent one isn't prevalent for the reasons to make the other one inferior. So the efforts of people wanting to move away from the heteronormative and cisnormative model it is still important because it provides a variety for people and representation for those who are marginalized and want to be represented within their religious belief. And you want them to feel as equally as important because they are. So no one is better than the other. No model is better than the other, whether it's cisnormative, heteronormative, or representative of the LGBTQ plus community, or none at all. Like no one is better than the other. And although a lot of people are making an effort by showing more representation in ritual and removing the gendered symbolism altogether, it's really important to remember that the gendered symbolism can still be completely relevant and meaningful and powerful to some people. And the important thing to remember is that the prevalent one isn't prevalent for the reasons that the other is inferior, if that makes sense. Like the most popular model shouldn't be popular because all of the other ones are lesser. It should be, just as equal as any other idea.
I know that when I create events or any kind of a program for the community, I'm really very mindful of wanting to create more inclusive and welcoming spaces for the LGBTQ individuals within the pagan community. Are there any tips or thoughts that you might want to put out that people might want to concentrate on when they're trying to do that?
So again, and I don't want to feel like I'm repeating myself over and over, but I think it all goes back to the idea of communication. So, if you wanted a cisnormative, heteronormative model for your group or ritual, then let everybody know. We can't stop people from doing these things, whether people agree or disagree. And like we said earlier, the whole premise is, of paganism is about freedom of expression, but also provide alternatives. So you can't promote this freedom of expression and then only provide one method of expression. So we want to see diversity. So we need everyone to feel like they have a safe space, and that is a fundamental right for everybody. And it's really important to remember when overseeing religious communities that this is provided. And people have often turned away, and they say that they've turned away from the likes of the Abrahamic religions because they don't feel safe enough to express their whole being, in their spiritual belief and in their spiritual community. And many people have said this is why they come to paganism, which does show that paganism is doing a good job so far. Without doing anything from this point onwards, evidently, we're, as a community, something is going right enough that people are coming to it for that reason. But ultimately, nothing is ever perfect. And I don't actually think it's possible to have this utopian model of inclusion. There's always going to be somebody who's unhappy no matter where they come from, what their background is. And so, I think the steps in kind of creating this safe space is openness and diversity and representation. So, it's a silly example would be to say if you hated mashed potato, you wouldn't attend a festival detailed as celebrating mashed potato. You'd find something else that you liked, like a festival on ice cream or chips or, whatever. So
Right.
you can't please everyone, but we need to know what's happening and we need to know that there are alternatives available. So, I mean, this is like way beyond anything I think would be capable of if they were just organizing events. But I think ultimately it would be really great to one day see some sort of web page or an app or something where pagans who are promoting events and meetings, they can kind of declare this inclusivity in one place. So it's really hard finding communities sometimes. And I know a lot of Facebook groups have a declaration of inclusivity in their little bio. But, you know, maybe not all of the ones available are as inclusive as they would hope and think they are. So I think there should be a lot of information provided. I think there should be one space. So if somebody's ever worried about something being not inclusive, and that's not even of LGBTQ plus, this is of disabilities, this is of ethnic minorities, you want to be able to have an accessible information platform where you can make an informed decision on events that are going to be inclusive of as you as a person and a safe space for you. So I don't know if that's already available in maybe the US, or I don't think it's available in the UK. Maybe it is, but maybe it's really well hidden. And I think that's the point, is I think there needs to be a lot of promotion of these things. So things are more accessible for people who are wanting to understand the level of inclusion that the space they're entering has, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Now, paganism often emphasizes personal connection with the divine. How can the concept of personal pagan practice be used to challenge heteronormative societal expectations?
Okay, yeah, I like this question. It's a good question. Thanks for asking. So, um, oh, I think some of the biggest challenges, like I've said, are communication. Oh, wait, can you repeat the question and start and I start again? Is that okay?
Absolutely. Yeah,
Thank you.
totally. And if you ever need to do this, yeah, we can edit anything out.
Fab.
Paganism often emphasizes personal connection with the divine. How can, I'm sorry, I'm going to ask that. I'm going to do that one more time. I apologize.
That's okay, no, go for it.
Paganism often emphasizes personal connection with the divine. How can the concept of personal pagan practice be used to challenge heteronormative societal expectations?
Okay. So, personal practices are more popular nowadays. So, now it's also possible that this has been caused by the increasing number of minority groups, and they're wanting to get away from certain aspects of certain structures, so like heteronormativity. But there's no way of truly knowing this. So the importance of lone practice is important in paganism, and it's invaluable in the efforts to tackle the dominance of heteronormative and cisnormative representations. And I think group practice is still important because of the sense of community. And that's something that's really valued within paganism, because even though there's a lot of minority groups within paganism, paganism as a whole does face its own battles with prejudice and stereotypes and misinformation. So this sense of community is definitely important for people so they feel like they belong. But kind of back to the question, um, the move towards more solitary and more personal practices, they've allowed new things to be invented and created and to be thought up. So many people within paganism kind of work off guidelines from others because there is no doctrine or dogma within it. So by people going away and exploring different ways to connect to the deity in whatever forms that resonate with them the most. This diversity of practices then being shared, whether that's just between two people and then that person goes on, it's a chain reaction. So even if it's not publicized necessarily, it does get around the community. And so
Yeah,
without people going away and reinterpreting these things, with their own personal connections. Nothing would ever change or progress or diversify. So I think that it's definitely vital to the challenges faced within heteronormativity. If that did that answer the question? Yeah.
absolutely. No. And I think
Yeah.
it's a great answer. Thank you. Now, we've discussed this a little bit before, but I want to kind of go back to it a little bit and revisit this question. Have you seen any examples of how pagan rituals or practices are being adapted or reinterpreted to be more inclusive of diverse sexualities and gender identities? Because I think this is something that many of us who create rituals or even any kind of a program, and we want it to be inclusive, but we're struggling, I think, to find ways to kind of be more inclusive. I mean, for me, like I'm like, well, just like talk to people, communicate. But like I think often that's missed. But are you aware of any ways that these rituals or practices are being adapted or reinterpreted?
Yeah. So um, There's many different ways, and as I've said before, you know, a lot of people have removed either the idea of gender or the sexualization of themes and imagery, and they've just took them out altogether, and instead they've replaced them with the notion of the male and female binary, and they've replaced it with more simple and ungendered concepts. So we've got the likes of light and dark, and sun and moon, positive and negative. And then there's no way that anyone can not feel represented, because no one individual is represented through these. It's just this kind of binary polar model. And therefore, there's no hierarchy being implied when it comes to any sort of human relationship or gender identity, because that's not the model that they're looking at.
Right.
When it comes to celebrations, I think people are eliminating, the idea of gender roles too. So, whereas you would say sometimes you would split people into god and goddess groups, you can be open, it's open to go into either, regardless of the gender that you're assigned at birth. So even though there's still this gender representation there, it's not reflected on the participants so strictly. And so I think that's good. So for the people who still want the model and they feel less, say for a female who's less attracted or doesn't resonate as much with the goddess, they can still then choose to go to the god. And so, yeah, you
Right.
can keep the gendered representation, but it's the one that you most relate to. And, also gender essentialism as a theme is quite prevalent in certain pantheons and the mythology of that pantheons. And so a lot of deity imagery, like I said about the Aphrodite kind of,
Right.
they have been generalized and sexualized. So popular images aren't quite representative of the majority of society anyway. So, if you think of things like the Valkyries in kind of Norse traditions, and you've got the Mead Maidens, these are often really skinny, big breasted sex symbols. And,
Yeah.
instead of when they reenact and assign these roles within some sort of practice, they're now increasingly being open to all. So just because you're not an attractive woman doesn't mean you can't dress and represent them in this kind of role. And also even druids. So, when you think of a druid, it's really hard not to think of this white robed, bearded, older man. And I
Yeah.
think that, the imagery of that is being reduced, and the girl boy ordering in a lot of sorry, I'll start that again. And
No,
the boy
no, it's totally
girl,
good.
oh sorry. And so the
Good.
boy girl ordering, that's also getting eliminated in practice, and they're less rigid with that. So if you're kind of going hand in hand in a circle, it's more the natural order that people flow to. It doesn't necessarily have to be boy girl, boy girl. And I've also heard of groups eliminating pronouns altogether. So, and this is to the participants, not even just the representation of the deity, excuse me, in the mythologies or the rituals or the themes. And so, instead of, presuming somebody's gender identity and referring to them as she or he, everybody just gets referred to as they, them. And that way it's kind of inclusive of all. And so, yeah, there's definitely more and more little things that are showing more of a representation for like non-heteronormative, non-cisnormative people. And these are becoming more and more prominent. And I mean, I could get together a list of books as well if you wanted. I don't know how we'd go about that, but I could send over any books and titles of books that would include this polarity theme in practice, and how they show that this can be represented in ways other than just gender. But I do think it's harder to see alternative representations in deity despite all of these materials being available. Um, So yeah, and a big suggestion to the wider community would be to just increase the knowledge of these things. So, a perfect example is that I've got a book. I think it's called Rites of Pleasure. Can't remember who the author is, sorry, but it was published in 2004, and it has an entire chapter covering alternative genders and alternative sexualities in this book, which shows that people have been trying to move away from the heteronormative, cisnormative models for 20 years, if not more. That's just a book published in 2004. So, there is more material available. I think the important thing is it just needs to be more openly accessible, more publicized, and kind of talked about within the community. So for the people who are looking for an alternative, they know exactly where to go rather than kind of struggle individually.
My last question for you is, looking towards the future, what steps do you think the pagan community, again, an all-encompassing term, can take to become more inclusive and representative and create representative space for everyone?
Again, so, at the risk of sounding repetitive, I think the most important thing is to increase inclusivity is to explore this diversity of opinions and have them readily available and readily communicated to the community as a whole. So heterosexuality is often the default that everybody goes to because that's just, a theme through wider society. And it is the
Yeah,
most prominent, historically, it's unmarginalized. And so a lot
right.
of the time, people they have this aversion to alternatives, and that just comes from kind of ignorance, fear, and just a lack of understanding of this alternative. So I think in order for any sort of community to become more inclusive, then this diversity, it needs to be present, it needs to be readily available, and it needs to be completely accessible for all, not just the LGBTQ plus people looking for some sort of representation of a minority. It needs to be available to the community as a whole. So when, the heteronormative aspects, when those people who only know the heteronormative aspects, when they come to see this alternative, that they're not shocked and they're not, reacting aggressively out of fear that the heterosexual aspects are being eliminated in favor of an alternative, if that makes sense.
Right.
So, yeah, if you want this community to be more inclusive, then this diversity, it needs to be seen by all, but without pushing one agenda over another. And that's quite, I think, difficult because a lot of the community, like I said, a lot of the community can be quite reactive to change. And so by better educating the community and by getting the community to better communicate within itself, then, everything is open and everything's on the table. So people who are making decisions on how they can express themselves freely, they can make these decisions on honest and well-informed grounds. So if you aren't inclusive to a certain community, if you're not inclusive, if your group isn't inclusive to sexualities, not inclusive to genders, not inclusive to disabilities, not inclusive to ethnicities, etc., then you need to openly state it so that those people who either are part of those communities or don't relate to those aspects, that they're not going to be interested in participating and they won't. So what we don't want, and what definitely does happen, is sometimes people who aren't communicated to enter into groups and spaces that they believe to be inclusive and they're not. And that's what is difficult, and that's what I think people are finding really hard. So again, although I've said it earlier and maybe multiple times, it is near impossible to please everyone. But ultimately,
Right.
everybody does have this freedom to choose. And so this difference of opinions, it's great and it's valued and it's part of paganism's flexibility. And so even though the community can't always agree, I think it's important to spread as much information about as much as possible. And yeah, I think, inclusivity just kind of follows from that. But ultimately, nobody's ever going to be happy, I don't think.
Well, yeah. Jennifer, I want to really thank you for being on the podcast. These topics are so important and you've answered these questions so well. I can't thank you enough. And I really just want to I'm so impressed by your answers and your covering of these topics. I don't think anybody else I've ever heard has talked about these things so well. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you very much.
That was my conversation with scholar Jennifer Ball. A huge thank you to Jennifer for sharing her research and insights with us today. It's been a fascinating exploration of LGBTQ plus experiences within paganism. Tune in next week for more of the Calling the Quarters podcast. May you have a blessed week.